Thank you. I am hooked up. Can you hear me okay? Well, good afternoon, everybody. I'm delighted you're here, and I'm delighted that I'm here myself after the speakers this morning. I'm feeling quite energized in terms of the change agents that are in this room, and our common goal seems to be that we want to change the status quo of schooling in America, if not the world. So saying those words, you know, this is my first in-person conference since the pandemic. I think the staff here at the conference center deserve a round of applause. So let's put our hands together for them, because we're all trying to remember the practices that we had when we were all together in person. So during today's presentation, I hope to share a little bit about myself as well as my school district in terms of the work that we're trying to do to change the status quo. And these are the four ideas or outcomes that I'd like to be able to share with you. One is knowing the importance of your why. And we heard an earlier speaker talk about their personal why, but you need to know your organizational why as well, because that's something that's going to sustain you during the tough work that's ahead when you're about to implement this level of change. I also want to share the significance of names, what that means in terms of what you call things within your system. We heard earlier about the many definitions of different things like artificial intelligence. The same happens within competency-based learning. There's a lot of definitions there as well. You need to make sense of one for your system. And then I'm going to share with you our Westminster Learning Model. We've actually started implementing this work in the 2009-2010 school year. So we've been at this a while. But during that time, we've had many lessons, many tough lessons. And I'll share some of that with you as time allows. And then to talk about the potential extremes that you can have. We're just coming out of a pandemic. My gosh, is that a big one or what? But there are others that you need to attend to. But when I think about the journey of school, I wonder why it can't be more like Ride the Rockies, which is an annual event that we have in Colorado, which lasts 6 days, where people take bicycles and ride around in the mountains. And I'm always curious about what's their motivation for that. What's their interest in that? So they have a personal interest in to accomplish this. And I kind of think school should be kind of the same, with a very well laid out path of what your destination is. And information to tell you the highs and the lows, so you can plot your own progress as you go forward. Now this has been going on since 1986 in Colorado. It's actually started by the Denver Post. And the idea behind it was that they would have cyclists go through very small towns in the mountain, and that would raise funds for the nonprofits within those towns that they pass through. So the path actually changes every year. But you can see it's pretty arduous. It's not for somebody like me right now. I can't do that tomorrow. I would need to put in some work to get there. But the information is there of what I would need to do. So there is a plan in place. And I think at the end, people have a desire to achieve something of personal worth to themselves. And isn't that what schooling really should be? You achieve something from that path, up those highs and lows, you set your goals, but it's of personal worth to you. You want to go to school. So when I think of my own experience of school, I think of conjecture. I started school when I was actually 4, and I was the third in the family, and I was really excited to find out where my older brother and sister went every day. That was a mystery to me. And they'd come home and talk about school. I was really excited, so I pestered my mom that I should go, and she said, finally, yeah, you go. Years later, I found out she was pregnant with my younger sister, so I think she had a lot of motivation to push me out as well. But as a kid, I showed up for the social interaction with friends. It wasn't necessarily the learning. I'm from Ireland, so I went to a small 2-classroom school, and there was actually 7 kids in my class, so I was one of the 7. And all I really knew was that I just needed to keep up with my peers. I didn't need to do more than them or less than them. I just needed to be with them. And somewhere along that journey, they thought I was smart enough, they actually moved me up a level. And then in the second classroom, the more senior level of the 8 years there, my teacher actually had the early stages of Alzheimer's. And being from Ireland, we didn't know a lot about Alzheimer's back then, and people culturally didn't want to really raise that issue. So my last 2 years in what we would call elementary school here in the United States, we didn't really have anything to follow. So it was very much conjecture. So as upon speculation of incomplete information for you as a student, you didn't know what the next thing was. There was a daily surprise in what you were learning. You never really knew what was coming next. Then a series of fragments. Now this went on through secondary school for me as well, which would be the equivalent of middle and high school here. You show up, the teacher directs the work, you do whatever those expectations are. There's nothing beyond that. But it creates winners and losers. And we heard earlier speakers talking about that. Adults are making choices about you where you've got not much input into those choices. And you come out a loser or a winner depending on how those choices have been formulated. Not sure what's going on with the cameras here. But systems should really build coherence. Okay. And that's really about competency. So what does a competency mean? It's really having proven skills and knowledge to do something well. Now, that's what it means to me. But people have different definitions of this, so you need to figure out what it means to you and your system. It's also capitalizing on personal attributes that people bring to the table. Students come to us, or I like to call them learners, with interests, with their own personal attributes, their own desires. Why isn't that worked into the menu of options for them in terms of how school is done? It needs to be systemic and systematic. When I think back to my own secondary school experience, I'd walk into this teacher's classroom, there's this one set of behavioral expectations. 50 minutes later, walk across the hall to a different teacher, different set of behavioral expectations. And as a student, you had to learn these behavioral expectations so you knew what was okay in a class and what was not. That's much more complicated with academic expectations. But there was never a list really posted anywhere in those classrooms of what the academic expectations were. Isn't that interesting? So this is meaning along the journey. Students need to be involved in their own education. They need to see themselves coming to school to work for themselves and their future, not something that's simply just happening to them. Now, when I talk about competency, I'm not really talking necessarily mastery. Mastery is a higher level of competency. It's a higher definition. And I think of that this way. We actually use this tool to talk about how to implement change in our district, but it's slightly modified here in terms of the hierarchy of different levels of mastery of something. And this comes from Mark Rosenberg's work in terms of adult learning. How do you become a master of something? And that can take years. We think of competency as right in the middle there. So you're a novice when you're first starting out. You're unconsciously incompetent. You don't know what you don't know. You begin to learn some things. Now you're consciously incompetent. You're aware of some things. You've got a little bit of knowledge about them. But to be really competent in that, you have to go a lot deeper. And that's where we define competent. Beyond that is expert and mastery. A discussion we had in our district is, do we want students to be masters of everything? And all of our content teachers, I'm science and math, so I wanted kids to achieve very high level math, very high level science. But we have people in our system who are adults who have their own degrees. They didn't do calculus necessarily to get where they needed to be. So do we need every kid to reach that absolute high level? Or do we need them to reach a certain threshold, and then from there they follow their passions and their interests to develop that expertise and mastery in the areas that their personal attributes really give them that support? So we call our system a competency-based system. It's based on that idea of a certain level of competency across all the content areas, as well as social-emotional learning. And it has to be a system. Every traditional school here in the United States, and probably across the world, has examples of excellence within it. But what about the school itself being an example of excellence, or the schools within a district being a sample of excellence? That's what we're trying to build in Westminster Public Schools. So part of that is really visioning what you want and then having the mission to drive that vision. So for us, it's preparing future leaders, learners, and thinkers for a global community. And that doesn't just stop with students. That's the adults in the system too. And then our mission is really, we need to create those opportunities for students where they're able to demonstrate their competency. They're agile learners, they can change, and they can contribute to the community as a whole, as well as to their own personal success. But that doesn't just happen. We also have values to make this more concrete for the adults in our system. So we did some work where the adults got together in large groups to agree upon these 10 agreements that we have here that really sets our values and leadership principles over time. The importance of teamwork is what I want to demonstrate here. I'm not sure what's happening with the sound, though. Okay, there's sound to go along with that, which I don't have on this today, apparently. But the idea here is that as you're building your system, you want everybody within that system to know what's going on. And in a school district, that would be your Board of Education, that would be your leadership, that would be your teachers, that would also be your students and your parents. If people don't know what's going on, they have a lack of information, and they tend to push back against change because they're not sure where you want to go. So you have to stand together as a team and work together as a team. Here's a picture of what our school district actually looks like. We have about 10,000 students, although we did see a drop this year in terms of the pandemic. We know we've had some very young learners stay at home, so I'm sure we'll see them in the fall. We've got 5 regular elementary schools that are pre-K 5. We've also got 2 traditional middle schools, if you will, 4 PK8 schools, and we've been moving the last couple of years to go more PK8 as our situation allows for us. Of some of those schools, we've got magnet schools as well. We've got 2 high schools, one large comprehensive high school of 2,400 students and one alternative school. And early learning as well has been a big part in our system. But overall, as our demographics, we're a minority-majority district. We have 74% of our students are Hispanic. Our free and reduced number is 76%. So we have students that come to us with some challenges. We're aware of those. We use those to describe ourselves. We do not use those to make excuses for ourselves. These students are very, very capable, and they bring lots to the table when it comes to the learning situation. Here's a visual of what our model actually looks like in terms of the components. And I want to spend a little bit of time on the outer circle, which are the tenets of the model. We say that learning is the constant, or learning matters most. Time matters least. Now that's easy to say. Implementing that in a pre-K-12 system is a little difficult. If learning matters most, you have to really define what that learning is and how you're actually going to know people get there. Time matters least insofar as you need to learn what you need to learn. Let's take the time to do it correctly. But as kids get to high school, there's actually less time. And there's more urgency on their part as they start thinking through this. We also think about personalized delivery. And we do draw distinctions between differentiated learning, individual learning, and personalized learning. Personalized learning is actually very student-driven with the guidance from the teacher. The other 2 are more teacher-centric, where it's driven by the teacher themselves. And then the top one is systemic and systematic. So one example of that would be when we adopt new curriculum, we adopted preschool through high school. An example is math. We adopted a curriculum 2 years ago that spans from preschool all the way up through high school, so that a student is not learning from different materials as they go up through the system, as they matriculate, but they have common elements from the work that happened the prior year. And I'll just zoom through these. The inner circle is really these elements here that we call the components of our model. And the first one is that shared vision. And that's really an important one, and it's undervalued. And about half the schools and school districts that have tried to implement competence-based education have failed because they did not do the work around building that shared vision. You have to do that with your entire community, the internal stakeholders as well as the external stakeholders. And it takes time. But parents love the idea of their student being able to work through on their strengths rather than waiting for the majority of a classroom to get to the same place. Leadership, big component. One example I'll share with you today is our principal leadership at the school level. We actually have a process in our school district to develop our own internal leaders and grow them into our principal positions within the district. We didn't do that initially, and we're bringing people in from the outside who did not understand our mission, they did not understand our cause, they did not understand what we wanted to do. We build that with students. In fact, one of our schools, one of our PK8s, their entire school model is built around student leadership and the attributes of student leadership. But leadership happens in all our schools, as does competence-based education. A lot of people get thinking about competency-based design. That's kind of the structures that support the system. So one example there is really your standards. We all know in this room that there's too many standards, and not all standards are created equal. And what do we want students to really know and be able to do? So our latest iteration of those is really built around the concept of proficiency scales, where we actually have a scale that delineates out the specific things that a student needs to know for each of the scores. We do not use Carnegie grading units. We use 1, 2, 3, 4, which is always an interesting conversation with parents to describe that numerical scale versus an alphabetical scale. They say, I don't know what a 3 is. We're able to point to those proficiency scales. This is what your child needs to know and be able to do to get a score of 3. And they struggle with that a little bit. And I say, what do they need to do to get an A? And who did they do it for to get an A? I was certainly in school when I could work really hard in this classroom and probably get a B, and not do much work in this classroom and get an A. Some of you have probably had that experience as well. So this is creating that common systematic piece around how do we judge the evidence that kids put forth in their learning. We also have continuous improvement. We do not have truth in a bottle in our system. We are continually evolving to get better. And when we went down this road first, it's really interesting how many problems we have pushed aside. And then we had to finally deal with these problems. One of those problems is the idea of social promotion. In fact, that was one of the reasons we went to this competency-based model, because we were matriculating students through our system who had not got those skills from the prior year. But yet they increased in age and they got moved up. So this is not grouping students by age. This is really grouping students by demonstrated skill in the different content areas. So it's quite fluid. Now, I know there's people thinking, so how do you do that in a high school schedule? Well, we have figured that out, but it took us a number of years to get there. So for us, we're always about continuous improvement planning. We do PDCA, plan, do, check, and adjust. And we do that quite often because there's lots of checking that you need to do in a system to make sure it's going well, and then there's adjustments that have to be made after that. But those 4 components lead to this bottom one here, the learner-centered classroom. So if learners are truly in charge of their own learning, what does that look like? Are they able to articulate their learning? Do they know what they're going to learn next? Do they know why they're learning that? So we work with our students to, even in kindergarten, we talk about graduation and what that means to them, and we tell them what their projected date is. And the ones who have older siblings get it pretty quickly. Ones that are brand new, they kind of struggle a little bit. But by the end of their first kindergarten year, they know what that is. And I remember talking to some kindergarten teachers, we need to be able to build on the aspirations of 5-year-olds. And they struggled with that initially. Well, we cannot pigeonhole kindergartens into a career that they may or may not go into. That's not the idea here. The idea here is to build upon their interest and what they're interested in. You ask a 5-year-old what they're interested in doing when they grow up, they will give you several answers. Why not capitalize on that? So all the system is set up is to really work with students where they're at, bring them to the next level, build on their interests and their passions so that they're the ones in the driver's seat. Now, it has taken us a number of years to really get to that level of detail. But I want to talk a little bit about the extremes. One was people's mindset. And this is the stakeholders that are internal to the district. Because some of our folks early on, they said, well, the current system's working well enough for some of our kids. Why do we need to change it? Our view is this needs to work for all kids. This is an equity issue. And we need to figure out how to make this work for all kids. So people need to have agile mindsets, and it takes some time to get there because you've been operating in a traditional system for so long, it's kind of hard to see what this new version looks like. And there are some graphics out there. One is an old lady and a young lady. You look at it, you see one or the other. You can't see both at the same time. So you'll have to work with people's mindsets in terms of the why behind doing this. That's where that shared vision and why is really, really important. The next one is political agendas. And those are both local political agendas as well as state and even national political agendas. When we were first doing this work, those folks interested at the national level in holding us up as an example of the work that we did, we were not ready for that at all. We were barely scratching the surface of what our problems were. We had not got any truth in a bottle on this. So that became political at the national level, because people started asking you, okay, you're doing this work, what data do you have to back up that you're successful? We did not have that data at that time. Locally, we had some folks who were not playing good team, and they were what we would call lone rangers. They were out there trying to do things on their own, contrary to what we're trying to do as a system, and that became political within the school system. Personal choices that people make. We know here in the United States, parents can choose to send their kids to any school they want, especially in Colorado. We have open enrollment laws. So even though all our schools work off a competency-based framework, if you will, there is choice within our own system for the students. So we have STEM school, we have a school of the arts, performing arts, we have a leadership school, and we have pathways that work through the system all the way up to the high school. So we now have high school students earning industrial certificates at the high school or in their area of interest, whether it's STEM or whether it's performing arts. So you need to be able to take personal choices that students have and work with that and build around that. That's tapping into those personal attributes as well. There's also perseverance. I think the pandemic has taught us about, fatigue. As we kept changing to the latest health guidelines in our district, that was very fatiguing. But as you're implementing such large change around an entire system, you have to persevere through that as well. I'm actually finishing up my 32nd year with our current district. And I can tell you, schools create the communities they are in. And early on, we did not do a very good job of identifying what our needs were. Our actual student demographics changed quite rapidly. And that happened around the year 2000, 2003, where we then became a minority school district, but we had not changed the practices that we had. We're still teaching the old way to, the middle of the group. But it's about all kids, and you have to persevere through that. So that's one of the extremes. Of course, the pandemic itself is an extreme. Now, what was interesting for us here was we were able to flip from in-person learning on a Friday afternoon to remote learning on a Tuesday, following Tuesday. We did that very, very quickly. We did not change our standards for graduates. We did not change what students were already working on, because they were already working on our learning management system. So that just was available to them from home instead of available to them from in the classroom. We are a one-to-one school district prior to the pandemic happening. So we had those devices in place for students already because of the moral conviction that we have that every student needs to learn at a high level, not just some. So that was one of the learnings for us in the pandemic, was that actually our competency-based system helped us, whereas some of our neighboring school districts, they were actually changing grading scales to say what graduates were actually going to be graduates. Then we had other school districts just saying, well, we finished the year in February, so whatever mark you got in February is your mark for the whole year. Now think about the outcome of that down the road for the student as well as for society itself. That is not good. If our traditional system is that fragile, we really have to change it to do something better for our kids and our community. And I think you're hearing that theme here today. So, is it worth it? Here's some of our results. In Colorado, we're allowed actually to have a 4-year graduation rate, a 5-year graduation rate, a 6-year, and even a 7-year graduation rate. But somehow in the United States, this 4-year graduation rate is a magical thing that a student is supposed to graduate within 4 years. Personally, I don't really believe that. I think a student needs to learn what they need to learn. And when I have conversations with parents, because they do talk to me about the 4-year graduation rate, I say, do you want your student to know these things right now? Or do you want to have them in remedial classes in college where it's going to cost you money and them time? And they usually think about, yeah, we need to get this done now so they're ready for college. The other thing as I ask parents is, what is the 4-year graduation rate of the college that you want to send your child to? They're not very good, folks. They're very low. So once parents are armed with that information, they think differently about how to use time. It's not about a magic 4 years. It's about getting the core knowledge that you need to be successful as we move forward. So what you see here is the blue line is our Westminster High School. It's the comprehensive high school I talked about with 2,400 students. The orange line is our state. State graduation rate is 81%, 81.9. Our high school this past year went to 86%, without lowering any kind of standards for graduation. Another number that we look at is the dropout rate. So you can see back in 2015-16, it was pretty high at the high school. That's a reflection of that social promotion piece. But over time, we are now beating the state in terms of where we are with our dropout rate. But we're still dropping out students, and we still have to do better than that. We shouldn't be having dropouts. One of the most vexing problems we have in our district is mobility because of the economic conditions of some of our families. Another measure we use, and this is an imperfect measure because this is based on traditional assessment and standardized testing. We do not teach or instruct our students in grade level cohorts. We have them in performance level cohorts. And those are like flexible grouping. They change depending on where the student is at within their learning. But this system is a reflection of an age-based system. It's the traditional model. It's the state test. And even with this imperfect measure, you can see when we started in 2010, we had a lot of schools in the red area. That's the turnaround area. And that's kind of a leftover from the traditional model. But as we go through the years, you can see the red disappears, orange, which is priority improvement, disappears, yellow improves, green improves. And then the section that's highlighted with the blue box, that's actually where we changed to the Common Core standards, which were much more rigorous. So the assessment was much more rigorous, and you can kind of see a similar pattern there. Now, with the pandemic happening, we've not had state tests the last 2 years, so that's going to be interesting for the state to figure out. So what have students in Colorado learned during the past year, during the pandemic? Now, I mentioned that as an imperfect model because there is bias in how assessments happen as well as how accountability system happens. And we've been very involved at the state level to actually pass what we call an accountability audit bill to audit the system of standards and assessments as well as how they're used in the accountability model. Because Colorado talks a lot about failing schools. There's a big difference between a failing school and a low-performing school. And when you're measuring based on traditional criteria and not using better criteria, you're going to come to some false evidence in terms of how things are happening. So I've been very quick in terms of what I've tried to explain, which is really deep. But one of the things our district is also committed to doing is to be a guide for others who are interested in this journey and open our system up to people from the outside where you can come talk and visit with students, teachers, principals, and others to see how this is actually happening within the schools. And coming this October 6, 7, and 8, we will have a summit where people can come and learn about this in much more detail. I mean, any of those one topics, high school scheduling, I could talk about that for a day, how that works in this model. I could talk about how to develop proficiency scales just as long, but I think it's going to be quicker for folks to see it. So I invite you to come to visit us in Westminster, which is north of Denver in Colorado. Come hear about how we do business, because that'll happen in school visits. And then we've got some speakers there. Dr. Robert Mazzano has been with us for quite some time along this journey. We also have Dr. Mark Elgard, who is the head of COGNI, which is an international accrediting agency housed here in Georgia. We are accredited through them, as well as by the state of Colorado. But I think the most value is really just people talking to people and the networking opportunities, kind of like that's what's happening here. So if you're interested in more, where is Max Math? Max, please stand up. Max, stand up. Max is one of our board directors. When I talk about shared vision, it's really involving folks at that level. Max has cards. If you want to find out a little more how to register for that event, he's got them there. And with that, I will conclude my presentation. So thank you.